Welcome everyone to your very first PowerPoint for Intro to Pharmacology. This is Lori Simmons and I am very excited to be teaching this class, but also a bit nervous since it is something new in my repertoire of things I've taught. So here we go. First of all, make sure that you look over your objectives because this is how you're going to be tested and will serve as your blueprint for your exam. Alright, here we go. Historically, drugs have come from plants, animals, and minerals. Most drugs nowadays are synthetic compounds manufactured in a laboratory. Chemists will create useful new drugs by altering the chemical structure of existing drugs. Synthetic drugs are more standardized in their chemical characteristics, more consistent in their effects, and less likely to produce allergic reactions. One thing I want you to know with synthetics is, when I said that chemists can create useful new drugs by altering chemical structure, for example, I can tell you that chemotherapy is made up of a combination of many different drugs. And one of the common plant sources that is included in that makeup is the Vinica flower plant. Just a little tidbit for you to learn something new. Drug classifications. Drugs are classified according to their effects on a particular body system, their therapeutic use, and their chemical characteristics. For example, morphine can be classified as a central nervous system depressant when we're talking about a specific body system, and a narcotic or opioid analgesic when we're talking about therapeutic uses. The names of therapeutic classifications usually reflect the conditions for which the drugs are used. For example, antidepressants or antihypertensives. However, the names of many drug groups reflect their chemical characteristics rather than their therapeutic use, such as adrenergics. Many drugs will fit into multiple groups because they have wide-ranging effects on the human body. An individual drug that represents groups of drugs is called a prototype. The prototype is most often the first drug of a particular drug class to be developed. It is usually the standard with which newer drugs in the class are compared. So, for example, morphine represents opioid analgesics, and penicillin represents antibacterial drugs. As new drugs become assigned to a group, they are compared with the recognized prototype. However, there are going to be some groups that lack a universally accepted prototype. Some prototypes are replaced over time by newer, more commonly used drugs. For this class, we will be using a specific prototype that will be provided for each drug class to you. Individual drugs have many different names, but the two that are most commonly used are the generic name and the brand name. The generic name is related to the chemical or official name and is independent of the manufacturer. Oftentimes, the generic name will be seen in lowercase. The generic name often indicates the drug group. So, for example, the drugs with generic names ending in "cillin" are related to the penicillins. The brand or trade name is designated and patented by the manufacturer. For example, amoxicillin is manufactured by several pharmaceutical companies, and they each assign their specific trade name. Trade names are capitalized, and again, generic names are listed in lowercase. Drugs are often prescribed and can be dispensed in either generic or trade name. Generics are available for most drugs and can be substituted for the trade name drugs unless the prescriber specifically requests do not substitute on the prescription. There are times when generic drugs are not as therapeutically equivalent to the trade name drugs. There are prescription and non-prescription drugs, and these are the two ways consumers have access to drugs. A prescription drug requires a written order from a healthcare provider. They can also purchase over-the-counter with the abbreviation of OTC, and those do not require prescription. Various laws will regulate over-the-counter medications. Let's talk a bit more about over-the-counter medications. Over-the-counter drugs are products that are available without a prescription for consumers' self-management of a variety of complaints. At some point, some of these agents were approved as a prescription drug and were later found to be very safe and useful for patients. And so they were taking off the prescription drug list because they were deemed safe and they were grandfathered in to the over-the-counter drugs. Nurses should consider several problems related to over-the-counter medications. Taking these drugs could mask the signs and symptoms of underlying diseases, making diagnosis difficult. Taking these drugs with prescription medications can result in drug interactions and interference with drug therapy. This also includes herbal supplements. Not taking these drugs as directed could result in serious overdoses. A prime example of this is acetaminophen or Tylenol for the brand name. People don't realize that the maximum dose per 24 hours is 4,000 milligrams and often overdose. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act was established in 1970, and under that act came Title II, which is specific for the controlled substances. This regulates manufacturing and distribution of narcotics, depressants, stimulants, hallucinogenics, and anabolic steroids. This Controlled Substance Act requires pharmaceuticals to maintain physical security and strict record keeping of these controlled substances. The DEA also known as Drug Enforcement Administration, are the people who enforce the Controlled Substances Act. Part of what they do is they provide registers for individuals and companies legally empowered to handle controlled substances. They also regulate documentation and handling of controlled substances. And finally, they oversee prescription, distribution, storage, and use of these drugs and closely monitor them. The DEA assigns prescribers a number, which they must include in all prescriptions they write for a controlled substance. Prescriptions for Schedule II drugs cannot be refilled, and a new prescription is required. Nurses are responsible for storing controlled substances in a locked container, administering them only to people for whom they are prescribed, recording each dose given on an agency narcotic sheet and on the patient's medication administration record, maintaining an accurate inventory, and reporting discrepancies to the proper authorities. On page 6 of Abrams, there in box 1.1, there's the category of controlled substances. The lower the number, the higher the potential risk of addiction. It would be important for you as students to know what kind of medications fall under each schedule so that you have an idea of what is in each schedule. And here again is that schedule. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration, also known as the FDA, is responsible for ensuring safety and efficacy of drugs before they can be marketed. Since 1962, newly developed drugs undergo extensive testing before being marketed for general use. A clinical trial will proceed through 5 phases if there's continuing evidence of drug safety and effectiveness. Initially, drugs are tested on animals. In the preclinical trials. In phase 1 studies, the chemicals are tested on human volunteers to determine the safe dosage, route of administration, absorption, metabolism, and excretion. In stage 2 studies, the drug is tried on informed patients with a specific disease, and their response is compared to healthy subjects. In phase 3 studies, the drug is used in vast clinical markets with close observation of patients for adverse effects. If the drug passes through all of those phases, the FDA will approve it, and the drug will move into phase 4, which is continual evaluation of the drug. There are drugs that have been approved by the FDA and put out on the market, and then have been recalled because with that continual monitoring, they felt the drug was too unsafe to allow it to be out there. The FDA has issued black box warnings about drugs that can cause serious adverse effects. The warning will appear on the label, the package insert, and any marketing literature. As you go through your readings for each unit, you will find medications that have the black box warning. it would be important to understand why and what's the adverse effect that is creating this warning. Just a little funny for you. Now let's move on to looking at drug labels. Drug labels, as you can see, provide a lot of information. It is important to become familiar with what can actually be found on a drug label. Here we are with some of the common things highlighted for you. Remember, the brand or trade name is the manufacturer's name for the drug. The generic name is usually the chemical name, and it must be on all labels. We will also find the dosage strength, which is the amount of drug in a specific unit of measurement. The form of the drug, or the structure of it. In this case, it is an oral suspension. Supply dosage is the strength and form of medication, and in this instance, when we look at it, is 200 milligrams per 5 mLs. Amount is the total quantity within the container of a drug. In this instance, it is 473 mLs. Our route is orally, that is the method of delivery. There will be directions specifically for each drug. So in this instance, it is telling us to shake well before we use. There will always be an expiration date, and it's very important to be aware of the expiration date. Drugs can either increase in their effects or decrease in their effects after the expiration date. And so they should be gotten rid of appropriately by taking it back to the pharmacy, or a lot of local police stations will have days where they will accept prescription drugs. There may also be special alerts on a drug label, like keep refrigerated or protect from light. So let's practice reading a drug label here. Take your time, and I know there's only a few questions here, but try to find the other things that were shown on the previous slide. Now let's talk a little bit about safety in drug administration. Patient safety with medication administration begins by adhering to the rights of medication administration. There are 10 rights to medication administration, and we will go over those in a moment. Quality and Safety Education for Nursing, also known as QSEN, was sponsored by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and is committed to continuously improving in the quality and safety of healthcare systems by focusing on knowledge, skills, and attitudes required in the preparation of future nurses. QSEN, with regards to drug administration, has certain things that they have pointed out. They want appropriate abbreviations to be used. And there is a do not use abbreviation list out there from Joint Commission. They want to look at the benefits and limitations of technologies like barcoding that we have for our medications and how we can scan our meds. They also like the fact that the electronic health record has built-in automatic alerts to help a nurse make a good clinical decision, and the fact that now providers put in their own orders through the order entry system within the electronic health record, eliminating the chance for a mistranscription of an order to occur. Isn't it kind of funny how we talked about QSEN in intro and now it's still following you? Well, look at that. The National Patient Safety Goals. We talked about those in intro as well. Remember, Joint Commission makes those? And they annually update their patient safety goals. One particular area that is always on the National Patient Safety Goals is medication administration. It most often is related to proper identification of the patient. Nurses should always use 2 patient identifiers, typically the patient's full name and date of birth, in addition to scanning the patient's ID bracelet. What do you think could happen in this instance if I just scanned the patient's ID and did not do my 2 identifiers? I know that the chance of a patient having the wrong patient ID bracelet on is quite slim, but it can happen. So it's always important to accurately identify your patient. So let's look at the nurse's responsibility when it comes to med administration. So, I previously suggested administering drugs using the 10 rights. Well, do you know what those are? It's the right drug, right dose, right patient, right route, right time, right reason, right documentation, right patient education, right evaluation, and right to refuse the medication. These rights are goals of the medication administration process and are used to reduce medication errors and harm that unfortunately continue to be a problem over the years. Other things that nurses are responsible for is assessing their patients for adverse drug effects, especially if it is a new medication that the patient is just starting to take while they're hospitalized. That's why it's important to know your peak times for drugs. Intervening to make the drug regimen more tolerable. What the heck do I mean by that? Anybody have an idea? Well, let's say, for example, because I remember this because it did traumatize me. Back in the day when I was probably grade school, I got tonsillitis a lot. And in my younger years, I had to take the oral suspension of penicillin. Well, let me tell you, they didn't have all those flavorings that they do nowadays. And that, literally, as soon as it hit my mouth, all I wanted to do was throw up. So, the simple things of like adding flavoring makes it more tolerable for the patient and that they will follow the drug regimen. It is important to provide our patient teaching about the drugs so that they understand how to take them appropriately when they go home. So this is where a little bit about our health literacy comes in. Remember when we talked about how patients don't always understand those drug labels? So this is where your patient teaching is very important. Also, it is the responsibility of the nurse to monitor and prevent medication errors. If you question something when it comes to medications, like you think a dose is too high, hold the medication, contact the healthcare provider, and make sure that that truly is what the healthcare provider wants. The effects of legal and institutional controls on nurses. There are drug laws from state to state and federally, and we also have our state practice acts for nurses. But those two vary from state to state, so it is important for the nurse to know their state drug laws and what it says about medication administration within the Nurse Practice Act. Nurses must be familiar with current regulations in their state. Nurses must adhere to and obey established drug control laws and protocols. So if you're going to be giving a scheduled medication, you need to appropriately fill out the proper paperwork when you pass that medication and keep a drug count. And again, you are legally responsible for the drugs that you administer. Strategies for studying pharmacology are listed here for you. I definitely would tell you to use your ATI Pharm Made Easy for resources to help you learn your medications. Concentrate on the therapeutic classifications and the prototype that you're assigned. If you can concentrate on that, you'll start becoming more familiar with the other drugs that are within that classification. They often work very similarly. And the only thing else that I can tell you is that the other drugs that may be within that therapeutic classification may end, again, remember I said Cillin, may have the same ending in their name as well. And again, that in and of itself can become confusing. Make drug cards on all your prototypes. As you will see in looking at your course schedule, there are certain drug cards that you will have to make and turn in for points. But it's not such a bad thing, because as you're in Foundation 1 clinics, you'll probably use these drug cards. So again, yeah, you're doing it for this class, but it's going to be helpful for another one as well. Focus on drugs' main characteristics and how they act. You can go through and read these other things, but I will tell you, it is important to keep an up-to-date drug reference readily available. There are so many drugs out there, and as a nurse, you're not going to know them all. And there's always new ones coming out. When I'm passing meds and I am not familiar with a medication that I'm going to give, I always go and look that medication up before I give it, so that I have an understanding of how it's going to work, what potential side effects my patient might have, and are there any specific nursing considerations I need to know about. I hope this turns out well, because this is my first recording, and honestly, I was a bit nervous. But here it is, and I'll get it posted here soon on YouTube. And I think I have to share the link with you, which I will do in Talon.